Hi, all of you, and welcome to the nervous system. We're going to talk about all sorts of cool things that happen there, the resting membrane potential, and how this current works in the body. Very, very cool. But first of all, how is it organized? So this is sort of old hat for you, central nervous system, peripheral nervous system. But it is one crazy wiring. Hence my picture here of these wires. So brain and spinal cord, central nervous system, everything else is peripheral. Everything else is nerves that are exiting the spine and going somewhere else. If you think of it in terms of a little picture like this where central is in pink and peripheral is in yellow, it could involve as little as 3 neurons. You know, one that's incoming. Let's say it's a sensory receptor in your eye, light's coming in. And let's say it's coming in and it's coming into the central nervous system. It's connecting with one other interneuron and shooting back out again, making you, let's see, blink or something because some funny thing came into your eye. Or light came into your eye and you're forming an image. So, also something touching you. You felt something came in and you moved your hand away. So as little as 3 neurons could be involved in a response, which is always amazes me. So there is a picture where you have the terminology is used here, where it's afferent is arriving and efferent is exiting. So you remember because A is for arriving and E is for exiting. The interneuron is not shown here, but arriving and leaving, so that's a good thing. Now, the subdivisions of the nervous system, as I said, it's central with the brain and the spinal cord, and peripheral, which is everything else. Now, the everything else gets a little complicated. Less complicated when it's sensory, because look at this, sensory, where's that sensation coming from? Well, it's either coming from something somatic, like something that you have total control over. It's hurting your muscle. It's hurting your skin. You can tell where that's coming from. Or from the visceral. So from the viscera means you really don't have that much control over it. It's like, my pancreas is sore today. Nah, you can't tell that, right? Oh, geez, the top lobe, the upper lobe of my liver is not quite right. So that's the visceral sensory. Now, when it's motor, we have somatic motor, right? You can move your arm, you can make a face, you can do whatever you want. Visceral, it's coming from the viscera, it's coming from the organs, a little bit more complicated. And there, it's very complicated because it is managed by the autonomic nervous division, which is the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. So these have their own wiring, they have their own neurotransmitters, and it's the switch. It's the switch that says, it's motor, right? So it has to do something. So it's the switch that says, on, you're going to digest right now. Off, you're not going to digest. On, your cardiac rate's going to go up, on, switch off. No, it's not going to do that. So when it's a motor thing and it needs to respond to something, you have these 2 separate divisions with their own neurotransmitters, their own wiring that are going to say, go now, don't go now. Okay? So, for example, sensory division, you nail yourself on the toe, right? You hammer on the toe, and that would be somatic. Sensory, because you are totally aware of what location it is, and that would be somatic. Visceral sensory, abdominal pain, not so easy to understand where that's coming from. In the motor division, somatic nervous, voluntary, visceral is autonomic, involuntary, and there it is. It's all written out for you here on a slide what I just spoke about, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, often called the rest and digest and the fight or flight. Now, nerves. Nerves are confusing to people, to anatomy and physiology students. It's what is a nerve, what is a neuron? So neurons that are traveling together make a nerve. Okay, so a nerve is many axons usually, many axons of neurons that are traveling together. And if you had to measure that, you have about 45 miles of nerves that are wired through your body. So that's a lot. And these are all peripheral nervous system. There's three main structures of the motor neuron that we want to remember, and that is the soma, or the cell body, and the dendrites. That's the one that's going to detect incoming information, sensory dendrites coming in, and the axon going out. Axon going out, and that is usually covered by a myelin sheath, which is a fatty sheath which is going to protect that current from just flowing away to nowhere land. So think of it as the coating on a wire like you would have on your lamp, and that's protecting those electrons from running away from you. Okay, you've got a myelin sheath. Dendrites do not. There it is, the soma and the axon. And the axon with a yellow here is what has the sheath around it, and then the nerve ending, or this should be neuron ending. This is that's wrong. That picture. So dendrites attach to the cell body, but look, they could be amazing. You could have hundreds of branching dendrites coming off, not just 2 or 3 the way we draw them usually. Okay, so these are intense, and each dendrite connects to axons of other neurons. So there it gives you an understanding of that wiring that I showed you behind that computer on the first slide, where things get completely tangled and hard to decipher. So the name that we give to a junction between 2 neurons is a synapse. And here's hundreds of synapses. I tried to overlap these and show that if you have hundreds on one and hundreds on the other, you pretty soon have a tangle of these dendrites all over. Very interesting. So these dendrites are going to increase the surface area of the neurons, correct? And why? Why would you need that? So they can communicate with multiple neurons, sending information. And another very interesting thing that's discovered pretty recently is dendritic spines. So on these dendrites, there are these little regions that we can see under a microscope. And they, it turns out, can function independently. They don't have to work through the axon and through the soma. They can be doing their own thing. And they can be sending messages back and forth to other axons. And that is pretty crazy. So here's a picture of those. So these are the dendritic spines. The axon would be down here, and these are all these little spines. And if this butts up against another one and they're able to connect directly, then that's different from the model that we always thought of. Okay, that signal has to come in through here to the cell body and then out through the axon. It turns out that these spines, here's a photograph of them, I'm going to close the window, the dog, they can associate to each other independently. And we don't know a whole lot about that, but it seems like they are involved in learning and memory. And that is pretty cool. In lab animals, I'm going to read you this. Environmental enrichment has been related to dendritic branching, spine diversity, and overall number of synapses. So the more synapses, right, the sort of more adapted to its environment is this organism. So very cool that we have those. In addition, it's been shown to lead skill training, and that when you learn, look at my head here between the spines, that you're creating new spines when you're creating new connections and learning something. So think of yourselves right now, you're creating these development of these new spines because you're learning all about this all over again. Axons is usually just one per cell, or none sometimes, and they can be up to 1 meter long. So we think of cells as so tiny, but think of a huge axon, and think of also the metabolic demands, right, for this poor cell that's manufacturing proteins and things in the cell and in the cell soma, and it has to send it off to the other end of this axon. So hard thing to do when you think of making an enzyme and then transporting it all the way to the other end. A little bit more vocab. An axon hillock is the site where the action potentials originate. So it's where the axon joins with a soma, and the axon terminal is at the very end, and it's where it's going to form a joint or a synapse with dendrites of other cells. Okay, so here we have a synapse. Here's one cell synaptic. This is a presynaptic neuron. Pre, before. So this is one that comes before, and this comes next. This comes before, and that one comes next. This comes before, that one comes next. So these are all postsynaptic neurons or dendrites, and this is presynaptic. The wrapper, the myelin sheath. It speeds up the conduction of the impulse. If you don't have myelin sheath, like some very primitive animals don't have a whole lot of that, like a worm, it's limited in the velocity at which these signals can travel. We have some unmyelinated, and they are slower. They are slower to transmit, but the majority of our axons are actually myelinated. It insulates, it speeds up, and this myelin is formed by these cells called Schwann cells or oligodendrocytes. So these you can read about in OpenStax, and it tells you all the support cells to the neurons, and you'll have information on all those cells that are they're called the glial cells, the supporting cells of the axons and of the big boy neurons. That's what it is, of a motor neuron. This myelin is not covering the axon entirely. It leaves spaces in between, and those spaces are called the nodes of Ranvier. They're very important because action potentials have to travel from one node to the next node, because it can't. It's very slow to do it under the myelin. We'll see more about that later. I'm going to stop this now, and the next video will be on the resting and the action potential of the membrane. Thanks, guys.